Hi there. Welcome to my space of make-believe. I read stories in the public domain, my own free writes, and share snippets of books that I've read that perhaps you might like to read too. Now, if you've not the time to read, then let me read to you while you go about your day. I drop videos 3 times a week. Please subscribe and hit the bell to know when they are ready. I would truly appreciate it. Thank you so much. Now, the story today is about a woman who shares why she divorced her first husband, who was American, and why she then married a Chinese. These are short stories written in the 1900s by Sui Sin Far. You can find it in the book Mrs. Spring Fragrance. The book just entered the public domain, so you can find the ebooks online. You can buy them as well, or I can read it to you like right now. So if you're ready, let's begin. The story of one white woman who married a Chinese. Chapter 1. Why did I marry Liu Kangzi, a Chinese? Well, in the first place, because I loved him. In the second place, because I was weary of working, struggling, and fighting with the world. In the third place, because my child needed a home. My first husband was an American 15 years older than myself. For a few months, I was very happy with him. I had been a working girl, a stenographer. A home of my own filled my heart with joy. It was a pleasure to me to wait upon James, cook him nice little dinners and suppers, read to him little pieces from the papers and magazines, and sing and play to him my little songs and melodies. And for a few months, he seemed to be perfectly contented. I suppose I was a novelty to him. He having lived a bachelor existence until he was 34, but it was not long before he left off smiling at my little jokes, grew restive and cross when I teased him, and when I tried to get him to listen to a story in which I was interested and longed to communicate, he would bid me not to bother him. I was quick to see the change and realized that there was a gulf of differences between us. Nevertheless, I loved and was proud of him. He was considered a very bright and well-informed man, and although his parents had been uneducated working people, he had himself been through the public schools. He was also an omnivorous reader of socialistic and New Thought literature. Women's suffrage was one of his particular hobbies. Whenever I had a magazine around, he would pick it up and read aloud to me the columns of advice to women who were ambitious to become comrades to men and walk shoulder to shoulder with their brothers. Once I ventured to remark that much as I admired a column of men keeping step together, yet men and women thus ranked would, to my mind, make a very unbeautiful and disorderly spectacle. He frowned and answered that I did not understand him and was too frivolous. He would often draw my attention to newspaper reports concerning women of marked business ability and enterprise. Once I told him that I did not admire clever business women, as I had usually found them, and so had other girls of my acquaintance, not nearly so kind, generous, and helpful as the humble drudges of the world, the ordinary working women. His answer to this was that I was jealous and childish. But in spite of his unkind remarks and evident contempt for me, I wished to please him. He was my husband and I loved him. Many an afternoon, when through with my domestic duties, did I spend in trying to acquire a knowledge of labor politics, socialism, women's suffrage, and baseball, the things in which he was most interested. It was hard work, but I persevered until one day, it was about 6 months after our marriage, my husband came home a little earlier than usual and found me engaged in trying to work out problems in subtraction and addition. He laughed sneeringly. "Give it up, Minnie," said he. "You weren't billed for anything but taking care of kids. Gee, but there's a woman at our place who has a head for figures that makes her worth $100 a month. Her husband would have a chance to develop himself." This speech wounded me. I knew it was James' ambition to write a book on social reform. The next day, unknown to my husband, I called upon the wife of the man who had employed me as a stenographer before I was married and inquired of her whether she thought I could get back my old position. "But my dear," she exclaimed, "your husband is receiving a good salary. Why should he work?" I told her that my husband had in mind the writing of a book on social reform, and I wished to help him in his ambition by earning some money towards the publication. "Social reform?" she echoed. "What sort of social reformer is he who would allow his wife to work when he is well able to support her?" She bade me to go home and think no more of an office position. I was disappointed. I said, "Oh, I wish I could earn some money for James. If I were earning money, perhaps he would not think me so stupid." "Stupid, my dear girl? You are one of the brightest little women I know," kindly comforted Mrs. Rogers. But I knew differently and went on to tell her of my inability to figure with my husband how much he had made on certain sales, of my lack of interest in politics, labor questions, women's suffrage, and world reformation. "Oh," I cried, "I am a narrow-minded woman. All I care for is for my husband to love me and be kind to me, for life to be pleasant and easy, and be able to help a wee bit the poor and sick around me." Mrs. Rogers looked very serious as she told me that there were differences of opinion as to what was meant by narrow-mindedness, and the majority of men had no wish to drag their wives into all their business perplexities, and found more comfort in a woman who was unlike rather than like themselves. Only that morning her husband had said to her, "I hate a woman who tries to get into every kink of a man's mind and who must be forever at his elbow meddling with all his affairs." I went home comforted. Perhaps after a while James would feel and see as did Mr. Rogers. Vain hope. My child was 6 weeks old when I entered business life again as a stenographer for Rutherford and Rutherford. My salary was $50 a month, more than I had ever earned before, and James was well pleased, for he had feared that it would be difficult for me to obtain a paying place after having been out of practice for so long. This $50 paid for all our living expenses, with the exception of rent, so that James would be able to put by his balance against the time when his book would be ready for publication. He began writing his book, and Miss Moran, the young woman bookkeeper at his place, collaborated with him. They gave 3 evenings a week to the work, sometimes 4. She came one evening when the baby was sick and James had gone for the doctor. She looked at the child with the curious eyes of one who neither loved nor understood children. "There is no necessity for its being sick," said she. "There must be an error somewhere." I made no answer, so she went on. "Sin, sorrow, and sickness all mean the same thing. We have no diseases that we do not deserve, no trouble which we do not bring upon ourselves." I did not argue with her. I knew that I could not. But as I looked at her standing there in the prime of her life and strength, broad-shouldered, masculine-featured, and as it seemed to me heartless, I disliked her more than I had ever disliked anyone before. My own father had died after suffering for many years from a terrible malady, contracted while doing his duty as a physician and surgeon. And my little innocent child? What had sin to do with its measles? When James came in, she discussed with him the baseball game which had been played that afternoon, and also a women's suffrage meeting which she had attended the evening before. After she had gone, he seemed to be quite exhilarated. "That's a great woman," he remarked. "I do not think so," I answered him. "One would take from the sorrowful and suffering their hope of a happy existence hereafter, and add to their trials on earth by branding them as objects of aversion and contempt, is not only not a great woman, but to my mind, no woman at all." He picked up a paper and walked into another room. "What do you think now?" I cried after him. "What would be the use of me explaining to you?" he returned. "You wouldn't understand." How my heart yearned over my child those days. I would sit before the typewriter and in fancy hear her crying for her mother, poor sick little one, watched over by a strange woman, deprived of a proper nourishment. While I took dictation from my employer, I thought only of her. The result, of course, was that I lost my place. My husband showed his displeasure at this in various ways, and as the weeks went by and I was unsuccessful in obtaining another position, he became colder and more indifferent. He was neither a drinking nor an abusive man, but he could say such cruel and cutting things that I would be 100 times rather have been beaten and ill-used than compelled, as I was, to hear them. He even made me feel it a disgrace to be a woman and a mother. Once he said to me, if you had ambition of the right sort, you would have perfected yourself in your stenography so that you could have taken cases in court. There's a little fortune in that business. I was acquainted with a woman stenographer who reported divorce cases and who had described to me the work. So I answered, I would rather die of hunger, my baby in my arms, than report divorce proceedings under the eyes of men in a courthouse. Other women as good as you have done and are doing it, he retorted. Other women, perhaps better than I, have done and are doing it, I replied. But all women are not alike. I am not that kind. That's so, said he. Well, they're the kind who are up to date. You are behind the times. One evening I left James and Miss Moran engaged with their work and went across the street to see a sick friend. When I returned, I let myself into the house very softly for fear of awakening the baby whom I had left sleeping. As I stood in the hall, I heard my husband's voice in the sitting room. This is what he was saying. I am a lonely man. There is no companionship between me and my wife. Nonsense, answered Miss Moran, as I thought a little impatiently. Look over this paragraph, please, and tell me if you do not think it would be well to have it follow after the one ending with the words ultimate concord in place of that beginning with these great principles. I cannot settle my mind upon the work tonight, said James in a sort of thick, tired voice. I want to talk to you, to win your sympathy, your love. I heard a chair pushed back. I knew Miss Moran had arisen. Good night, I heard her say. Much as I would like to see this work accomplished, I shall come no more. But, my God, you cannot throw the thing up at this late date. I can and I will. Let me pass, sir. If there are no milestones around my neck, you will not say, sir, in that tone of voice. The next I heard was a heavy fall. Miss Moran had knocked my big husband down. I pushed open the door. Miss Moran, cool and collected, was pulling on her gloves. James was struggling to his feet. Oh, Mrs. Carson, exclaimed the former, your husband fell over the stool. Wasn't it stupid of him? James, of course, got his divorce 6 months after I deserted him. He did not ask for the child, and I was allowed to keep it. Chapter 2. I was on my way to the waterfront, the baby in my arms. I was walking quickly, for my state of mind was such that I could have borne twice my burden and not have felt it. Just as I turned down a hill which led to the docks, someone touched my arm, and I heard a voice say, Pardon me, lady, but you have dropped your baby's shoe. Oh yes, I answered, taking the shoe mechanically from an outstretched hand and pushing on. I could hear the waves lapping against the pier, when the voice again fell upon my ear. If you go any further, lady, you will fall into the water. My answer was a step forward. A strong hand was laid upon my arm, and I swung around against my will. Poor little baby, went on the voice, which was unusually soft for a man's. Let me hold him. I surrendered my child to the voice. Better come over where it is light and you can see where to walk. I allowed myself to be led into the light. Thus I met Liu Kangzi, the Chinese who afterwards became my husband. I followed him, obeyed him, trusted him from the very first. It never occurred to me to ask myself what manner of man was succoring me. I only knew that he was a man and that I was being cared for as no one had ever cared for me since my father died, and my grim determination to leave a world which had been cruel to me passed away, and in its place I experienced a strange calmness and content. I am going to take you to the house of a friend of mine, he said, as he preceded me up the hill, the baby in his arms. You will not mind living with the Chinese people, he added. An electric light under which we were passing flashed across his face. I did not recoil, not even at first. It may have been because he was wearing American clothes, wore his hair cut, and even to my American eyes, appeared a good-looking young man. And it may have been because of my troubles, but whatever it was, I answered him, and I meant it. I would much rather live with Chinese than Americans. He did not ask me why, and I did not tell him until long afterwards the story of my unhappy marriage, my desertion of the man who had made it impossible for me to remain under his roof, the shame of the divorce, the averted faces of those who had been my friends, the cruelty of the world, the awful struggle for an existence for myself and child, sickness followed by despair. The Chinese family with which he placed me were kind, simple folk. The father had been living in America for more than 20 years. The family consisted of his wife, a grown daughter, and several small sons and daughters, all of whom had been born in America. They made me very welcome and adored the baby. Liu Jusong, the father, was a working jeweler, but because of an accident by which he had lost the use of one hand, was partially incapacitated for work. Therefore, their family depended for maintenance chiefly upon their kinsman, Liu Kangzi, the Chinese, who had brought me to them. "We love much our cousin," said one of the little girls to me one day. "He teaches us so many games and brings us toys and sweets." As soon as I recovered from the attack of nervous prostration, which laid me low for over a month after being received into the Liu home, my mind began to form plans for my own and my child's maintenance. One morning I put on my hat and jacket and told Mrs. Liu I would go downtown and make an application for work as a stenographer at the different typewriting offices. She pleaded with me to wait a week longer, until, as she said, "Your limbs are more fortified with strength." But I assured her that I felt myself well able to begin to do for myself, and that I was anxious to repay some little part of the expense which I had been to them. "For all we have done for you," she answered, "our cousin has paid us double-fold." "No money can recompense your kindness to myself and child," I replied, "but if it is your cousin to whom I am indebted for board and lodging, all the greater is my anxiety to repay what I owe." When I returned to the house that evening, tired out with my quest for work, I found Liu Kangzi tossing ball with little Fong in the front porch. Mrs. Liu bustled out to meet me and began scolding in motherly fashion. "Oh, why you go downtown before you're strong enough? See, you look all sick again," said she. She turned to Liu Kangzi and said something in Chinese. He threw the ball back to the boy and came toward me, his face grave and concerned. "Please be so good as to take my cousin's advice," he urged. "I am well enough to work now," I replied, "and I cannot sink deeper into your debt." "You need not," said he. "I know a way by which you can quickly pay me off and earn a good living without wearing yourself out and leaving the baby all day. My cousin tells me that you can create most beautiful flowers in silk, velvet, and linen. Why not then you do some of that work for my store? I will buy all you can make." "Oh," I exclaimed, "I should be only too glad to do such work. But do you really think I can earn a living in that way?" "You certainly can," was his reply. "I'm requiring an embroiderer, and if you will do the work for me, I will try to pay you what it is worth." So I gladly gave up my quest for office work. I lived in the Liu Jusong house and worked for Liu Kangzi. The days, weeks, and months passed peacefully and happily. Artistic needlework had always been my favorite occupation, and when it became a source both of remuneration and pleasure, I began to feel that life was worth living after all. I watched with complacency my child grow amongst the little Chinese children. My life's experience had taught me that the virtues do not all belong to the whites. I was interested in all that concerned the Liu household, became acquainted with all their friends, and lost altogether the prejudice against the foreigner in which I had been reared. I had been living thus more than a year when, one afternoon as I was walking home from Liu Kangzi's store on Kearney Street, a parcel of silks and floss under my arm, and my little girl trudging by my side, I came face to face with James Carson. "Well now," said he, planting himself in front of me, "you are looking pretty well. How are you making out?" I caught my child and pushed past him without a word. When I reached the new house, I was trembling in every limb. So great was my dislike and fear of the man who had been my husband. About a week later, a letter came to the house addressed to me. It read, 204 Buchanan Street. Dear Minnie, if you're willing to forget the past and make up, I am too. I was surprised to see you the other day, prettier than ever, and much more of a woman. Let me know your mind at an early date. Your affectionate husband, James. I ignored this letter, but a heavy fear oppressed me. Liu Kangzi, who called the evening of the day I received it, remarked as he arose to greet me that I was looking troubled and hoped that it was not the embroidery flowers. It is the shadow from my big hat, I answered lightly. I was dressed for going downtown with Mrs. Liu and was preparing her eldest daughter's trousseau. Some day, said Liu Kangzi earnestly, I hope that you will tell to me all that is in your heart and mind. I found comfort in his kind face. If you will wait until I return, I will tell you all tonight, I answered. Strange as it may seem, although I had known Liu Kangzi now for more than a year, I had had little talk alone with him, and all he knew about me was what he had learned from Mrs. Liu, namely that I was a divorced woman who, when saved from self-destruction, was homeless and starving. That night, however, after hearing my story, he asked me to be his wife. He said, I love you and would protect you from all trouble. Your child shall be as my own. I replied, I appreciate your love and kindness, but I cannot answer you just yet. Be my friend a little longer. Do you have for me the love feeling? He asked. I do not know, I answered truthfully. Another letter came. It was written in a different spirit from the first and contained a threat about the child. There seemed but one course open to me. That was to leave my Chinese friends. I did. With much sorrow and regret, I bade them goodbye and took lodgings in a part of the city far removed from the outskirts of Chinatown, where my home had been with the Lius. My little girl pined for her Chinese playmates, and I myself felt strange and lonely, but I knew that if I wished to keep my child, I could no longer remain with my friends. I still continued working for Liu Kangzi, and I carried my embroidery to his store in the evening after the little one had been put to sleep. He usually escorted me back, but never asked to be allowed, and I never invited him to visit me or even enter the house. I was a young woman and alone, and what I had suffered from scandal since I had left James Carson had made me wise. It was a cold, wet evening in November when he accosted me once again. I had run over to a delicatessen store at the corner of the block where I lived. As I stepped out, his burly figure loomed up in the gloom before me. I stared back with a little cry, but he grasped my arm and held it. Walk beside me quietly if you do not wish to attract attention, said he. And by God, if you do, I will take the kid tonight. You dare not, I answered. You have no right to her whatever. She is my child, and I have supported her for the last 2 years alone. Alone? What will the judges say when I tell them about the Chinaman? What will the judges say? I echoed. What can they say? Is there any disgrace in working for a Chinese merchant and receiving pay for my labor? And walking in the evening with him? And living for over a year in a house for which he paid the rent? Ha 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 ha. His laugh was low and sneering. He had evidently been making inquiries concerning the Liu family, and also watching me for some time. How a woman can loathe and hate the man she had once loved. We were nearing my lodgings. Perhaps the child had awakened and was crying for me. I would not, however, have entered the house had he not stopped at the door and pushed it open. Lead the way upstairs, said he. I want to see the kid. You shall not, I cried. In my desperation, I wrenched myself from his grasp and faced him blocking the stairs. If you use violence, I declared, the lodgers will come to my assistance. They know me. He released my arm. Bah, said he. I've no use for the kid. It is you I'm after getting reconciled to. Don't you know, Minnie, that once your husband, always your husband? Since I saw you the other day on the street, I have been more in love with you than ever before. Suppose we forget all and begin over again. Though the tone of his voice had softened, my fear of him grew greater. I would have fled up the stairs had he not again laid his hand on my arm. Answer me, girl, said he. And in spite of my fear, I shook off his hand and answered him, "No husband of mine are you, either legally or morally, and I have no feeling whatever for you other than contempt." "Ah, so you have sunk." His expression was evil. "The oily little chink has won you." I was no longer afraid of him. "Won me?" I cried, unheeding who heard me. "Yes, honorably and like a man. And what are you that dare sneer at one like him? For all your 6 feet of grossness, your small soul cannot measure up to his great one. You were unwilling to protect and care for the woman who was your wife or the little child you caused to come into this world. But he succored and saved the stranger woman, treated her as a woman with reverence and respect, gave her child a home, and made them both independent, not only of others but of himself. Now hearing you insult him behind his back, I know what I did not know before, that I love him, and all I have to say to you is, go." And James Carson went. I heard of him again but once. That was when the papers reported his death of apoplexy while exercising at a public gymnasium. Loving Liu Kangzi, I became his wife. And though it is true that there are many Americans who look down upon me for so becoming, I have never regretted it. No, not even when men cast upon me the glance they cast upon sporting women. I accept the lot of the American wife of a humble Chinaman in America. The happiness of the man who loves me is more to me than the approval or disapproval of those who in my dark days left me to die like a dog. My Chinese husband has his faults. He is hot-tempered and at times arbitrary, but he is always a man and has never sought to take away from me the privilege of being but a woman. I can lean upon and trust in him. I feel him behind me, protecting and caring for me, and that to an ordinary woman like myself means more than anything else. Only when the son of Liu Kangzi lays his little head upon my bosom do I question whether I have done wisely. For my boy, the son of the Chinese man, is possessed of a childish wisdom which brings the tears to my eyes. And as he stands between his father and myself, like yet unlike us both, so will he stand in after years between his father's and his mother's people. And if there's no kindliness nor understanding between them, what will my boy's fate be? The end. Happy that she found a soulmate even if they have their differences. But that's the thing with love, eh? It doesn't see color or race. But I think it worked out for them because he loved her for who she was and she him for who he was. That more than anything else sealed the deal. Why do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Hope you enjoyed the story. Thank you for joining me today. And please do come back for more. Till next time, go grab a book to read or a pen to write and let your imagination take you anywhere. Be anyone. Do anything.